Okay, good morning again, Prof. Ko, Professor Tan. Thank you for joining us at our annual Benefactor Campus Experience event. And today's classroom experience entitled The Promises and Pitfalls of Conservation Technology by Professor Ko Lian Ping. My name is Ivy from the Development Office, and it's my pleasure to be your MC today. On behalf of the NUS Development Office, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. It is really good to see you all again, and we appreciate you taking the time to spend your Saturday morning with us. The Benefactor Campus Experience event is an exclusive event for you, our benefactors, who have continuously and generously supported us over the years. It is because of your support that the university is able to thrive in its mission of achieving greater excellence. I would like to introduce our speaker, Prof. Ko, who is no stranger to the conservation world. Prof. Ko is the director of the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, professor of conservation science, technology, and policy, and returning Singaporean scientist. He is most interested in environmental issues in the developing tropics, a region where population growth is most rapid, yet people are poorest, and where biodiversity is the richest, and yet most threatened globally. Prof. Ko's research focuses on developing innovative science and science-based decision support tools to help reconcile humanity needs with environmental protection. He is the founding director of conservationdrones.org, a non-profit organization that seeks to introduce drone technology to conservation scientists and practitioners worldwide. As a prominent researcher in the field of sustainability and environmental science, Prof. Ko has worked in institutions across the world over the last 16 years. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Prof. Ko.
Thanks very much, Ivy, for the introduction. Very good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to my classroom. I hope you feel younger today, like you're feeling more like students. Chris, very good. So my talk today will be about conservation technology, and I'll be focusing mainly on my own experience with using conservation drones as a conservation technology. Okay. How come there's no? So it's just give us a second. Okay, good. Sorry about that. So I don't actually need that. Yeah. Just a very brief introduction to myself. I am a tropical ecologist by training. In fact, I studied ecology here in NUS in the Department of Biological Sciences back in the 1990s. So it's quite a while ago. And back then, there were not many job opportunities for people like me who were very enthusiastic and interested in the environment. So I left Singapore not long after I graduated and have been away for, like what Ivy said, for the past 16 years. But even though I was away during all those years, I have always been still very interested in this part of the world, Singapore and Southeast Asia. So almost all of my research has been focused on this region. Now, in fact, one of my earliest research projects was about understanding the impacts of agriculture on the environment and biodiversity in this area. So part of understanding biodiversity impacts involves studying some of the most important species in the region, such as orangutans. We need to keep track of how many orangutans there are, where they live, and how their population and distribution change over time. Now, orangutans have an interesting behavior that you see here in the video. So every night, an adult male orangutan will go up onto a tree and build a nest using the branches and leaves that they can find around them. And you can even see a baby coming down to join the mother. And so it will spend the night, they will spend the night on the tree. The next morning, they will wake up and they will go about their business. And in that second night, they will go up to another new tree and build a new nest. So it's a very unique behavior. They build a new nest every night. So ecologists like myself have learned that by keeping track of the number and the location of these nests, we can actually keep track of the orangutans themselves, where they are, how many they are, and where they are moving to in different parts of the forest.
So this is like a sleeping...
It's a behavior. It's just a natural behavior for them. They sleep, and then they go to build a new nest, and then they sleep on the new nest.
And then the family comes?
No, so they build individual nests, except for babies. Babies will come and join the mom. Yeah. So even though we have learned to use the nest as a way to monitor them, it's still very time-consuming, right? So ecologists still have to spend many hours and days and weeks walking the forest to try to detect these nests and to count them. Some of us have tried to use helicopters or other small aircraft to try to look for these nests from above the forest canopy. But those kinds of solutions can be very expensive. You have to hire aircraft, and also quite risky because you would be flying quite low over the rainforest. If anything happens, there's no place to land. So a few years ago, a few of us took it a step further, and we tried to use a toy plane to look for these nests from the air. This is an early prototype I built almost 10 years ago now, and that was during the peak of the makers movement, in the 2010s or so. Everyone was building all kinds of DIY gadgets, and there was a lot of information online, which I used to build this prototype. And although it was a prototype drone, it was already quite a sophisticated device. It had an autopilot system, it had a GPS, it had some other sensors, even an airspeed sensor, and of course, it has a camera. So we cut a hole at the bottom of the fuselage and fitted this downward pointing camera so we can take our pictures as the toy plane flew over the forest. And there were also a lot of improvisations that we had to discover ourselves. And one is this orange thing that you see around the camera. It's actually just a kitchen sponge to wash your dishes. We found that we need to have the camera sit on the sponge so that the sponge can absorb the vibration of the motor or the engine so that we can get sharp pictures. So a lot of discovery, a lot of trial and error, very interesting work in the early days. But more importantly, because the toy plane had an autopilot system, that means we could program the drone or the plane to fly missions over a target area, taking pictures along the way. And that means we can send the toy plane far away from where we launch it to survey for remote or inaccessible areas, or survey for wildlife in remote and inaccessible areas. Now, of course, nowadays, anyone can buy a drone off the shelf and do the same thing. But back then, this was still an emerging technology. So we had to learn how to build and operate these drones ourselves. And in many cases, we were also the first ones to discover the many applications that they could be used for. Here you see me and my collaborator, Serge Week, in Zurich. And Chris, you might recognize this lake.
Sure, my hometown.
Oh, really? Okay. So I was based in Zurich back then. That was a long time ago. So after that first prototype, we built a few more versions, a few more models of the toy plane, and brought them to our field site in Sumatra, in Indonesia. The drones worked surprisingly well, considering that they were literally just put together with some glue and tape, and you can actually see the tape plastered all over the toy plane because we crashed them quite a lot as well. But it was important to us because for the first time, we were able to get a bird's eye view of the landscape of our forest without having to spend a lot of money, a lot of funds to hire a manned aircraft. And that immediately opened up a lot of opportunities. And because we were some of the first people, the first ecologists to build and to use this technology for research, ecological research and conservation, we quickly became swamped with many requests from all over the world. Our fellow scientists and some of the conservation NGOs to help them build and use this technology for their own applications. So over the subsequent few years, we started a nonprofit called conservationdrones.org and traveled around the world to many places around the world to help our colleagues build and to use this technology. And these colleagues were typically from the NGOs, from universities, also government agencies, and many of them, all of them became our partners. And together with these partners, we discovered more and more uses for this technology together. So what I want to do today is to share with you some of the lessons that we learned in terms of the promises and some of the challenges as well of using this technology. Okay, so in terms of promises, I think there are three main promising applications of this technology. The first is to use it for the enforcement of protected areas. The second is to map and to monitor habitats. And the third is the survey of wildlife. And I'll go through each one of these in the following few slides. And starting with enforcement. So this is a protected forest in North Sumatra. It's part of an ecologically very important ecosystem called the Gunung Lusa National Park. And some of you might have even visited this park before. What we did a few years ago was to collaborate with a local NGO in Medan, North Sumatra, and train them to use our drones, to build these drones for themselves, for surveilling parts of this national park, of this protected area. And they soon became very proficient in the use of this technology and were able to conduct regular surveillance flights and take pictures like the one you see here. Now, unfortunately, in this case, they detected very clear evidence of illegal logging, as you can see from that polygon, the line. And if you look carefully at this picture, you can see that the people responsible for this logging were actually very smart to leave a strip of forest along the river bank to hide the crime scene from the river traffic. So if not for this drone flying overhead and taking this picture, they wouldn't have been able to discover that this crime had even taken place. So it became a very useful tool for the local NGO and for the forest rangers and government agencies. We also operated our drones over the marine environment. In this case, we were invited by the Belizean Fisheries Department, together with an NGO, WCS, a Wildlife Conservation Society, to go to this very tiny island in Belize, Glover's Reef, which is about 50 kilometers off the coast of the mainland. So we packed up a few drones, we went there. It was a very challenging environment, not just because of the very small space that we had to launch and to land the drone, but also the very windy conditions. So here you get a good look at how small the island is. But it was an important project because the Fisheries Department wanted to explore how drones could help them patrol their marine protected areas to look out for illegal fishermen. This is not an illegal fisherman, it was just one of the staff trialing the application. But it was a very successful trial. Once the drone was in the air, it worked as expected, flying programmed missions that were capable of detecting these fishing boats. Besides flying around, some of our drones also swam, so they went into the waters a few times, but overall it was a good success. The second most common application is about the mapping and monitoring of habitats of the land or the forests. And I would say that mapping is probably the most successful type of application using conservation drones. Here, we were invited by the Forestry Department of New Caledonia, a Pacific island, to show them how drones could be used for monitoring their reforestation effort. Now, a drone is basically just a flying camera, and a typical mission involves flying the drone over a forest, taking hundreds and thousands of pictures, and then these images can be processed using software to produce not just a map of the region, but also a three-dimensional model of the forest itself. So this is actually a digital reconstruction of the forest that they wanted to monitor. In this particular case, because we used a special camera that could capture information from the near-infrared region of the light spectrum, we also get a sort of a reddish hue to the images. And the brightness of the images tells us how actively regenerating or actively regrowing the different parts of the forest are. So it gave the ecologists additional information to work with, and became it's a very important tool for research and for monitoring reforestation efforts as well.
So what's the meaning, sorry, of the different shades?
So the brighter ones just means it's photosynthetically more active. So it's probably...
It's newer?
Yeah, it's newer, it's actively growing, and then the duller areas are the ones that may be the older trees that are not so actively growing and photosynthesizing. So we could get a very good picture of where they are very active. And in another context, for example, in precision agriculture, it could also tell us where there may be problems with the vegetation. Maybe it's too dry, maybe there's some disease or some other factors. So it gives that kind of information as well.
So who would be the consumer of that information, like here in New Caledonia?
Mm-hmm. So
the government? Or?
Yeah, so it would be the local provincial governments in different parts of Caledonia. And it's just a way for them to monitor how the reforestation is happening. And the other thing I forget to mention is because this is a digital model, they can also make measurements. So they can keep track of how tall the trees are over time if they keep flying this area and keep producing this product, including the volume of the canopy and so on.
So would they use this information to write new government policies or new laws or?
Yeah. So for example, even before a reforestation project begins, they could use this to identify areas that need reforestation, right? Abandoned lands or clear lands. And then after the reforestation has started, they use it to monitor the progress of the project and so on. So, of course, there are also many other applications, and it's up to what the questions are for the local governments and managers. As many of us know, forest fires are a big problem in different parts of the world. I think in California there are lots of fires at the moment. In Australia, especially in South Australia, during the dry summer season, fires are a huge problem. And what the local authorities do is they conduct prescribed burns. So they deliberately burn parts of the forest understory, like what you see here, to remove the dry matter. And that's what they call the fuel load, the fire fuel load, so that they can reduce the risk of those dry matter catching on fire later on during the dry season. But the problem is they never had a good way of measuring or understanding how effective their burns are, their prescribed burns are. So they burn and then they just assume that the ground is cleared. So a few years ago, we collaborated with the Department of Environment in South Australia to use drones to map these forest sites before and after they had undergone a prescribed burn, to get a sense of the volume of the dry matter in the understory and how effectively they may have been cleared after a prescribed burn. And this is just one of the products. It's another three-dimensional reconstruction. And as you can see on the right panel, you can build models of the trees and the understory themselves. So it's also another very useful mapping application of drones. Now, another great feature of drones is they can be programmed to fly very low and very close to the ground to map the habitat in great detail. The Luz's red kangaroo, also called the Barring Batong, is a cute little marsupial in Australia that has become threatened from predation by foxes and cats and other predators, and they're also becoming outcompeted for their food because of the introduction of rabbits and the overpopulation of rabbits in parts of South Australia. The problem with monitoring these species is that they like to live in very dry, very almost desert-like habitats, like what you see here. So that makes it very challenging for ecologists to study them and to monitor them. So a few years ago, one of my former students, Matt Bowie, used a drone to map one of their habitat areas. And this is a 1 hectare habitat in South Australia. And if you look closely enough, you may even be able to see one of their burrows, the underground burrows. It's actually here. See this patch over there? There's another patch over here. And you can even see the entrances to the burrows, the holes. So it's a 3D model. And because it's a 3D model, the ecologist can go back to his lab or his office and make measurements on the model, so he doesn't have to actually do any measurements in the field. And this is also a permanent record of what happened or how the habitat looked like at that point in time. So again, very useful. If you keep doing this, you monitor how it changes over time. And also by detecting where the burrows are, you can keep track of where the animal is and how many there are and where they're moving about.
But for this to happen, there was a flight, right?
Yes, there was a flight. So this flight,
several flights.
Just one flight. So this 1 hectare flight just took the student maybe 10-15 minutes to fly. So it's super convenient and super cost effective. Of course, then you have to process the images in the computer, and that might take a few hours. Okay, so apart from mapping and monitoring habitats, drones are also, of course, useful for studying the animals themselves, and that's the whole point. As I mentioned earlier, the whole idea of building and using drones came out of our need to study the orangutans, right? So after some trial and error, we managed to come up with a solution, and this is how we do it. We will typically fly our drone in a zigzag pattern, a programmed mission, over a forest, take hundreds and thousands of pictures, and then we will process those images to produce this type of linear transects, like what you see here. And because these are very, very high resolution images, we are able to spot and to count the orangutan nests just by looking or combing through the images or these transects, or by training a machine learning algorithm to help us do the counting, to make it even more efficient. So this is a good example of how drones can be used to survey the animals themselves. But not all animals live in the rainforest, of course. Some live in very open habitats, like this yellow-footed rock wallaby. For these animals, a more efficient way of surveying and monitoring them may be to use a thermal camera carried by a drone. So a thermal camera is just a special camera that picks up the temperature of the animal, especially if there's a good contrast between a warm body and a cool surface area. So this is another project done by one of my students, former students in South Australia. Now this wallaby is very difficult to spot in the wild because they like to stay in rocky outcrops, and they are very well camouflaged in that type of environment. But because those rocky habitats are usually without trees, they are very exposed, so the wallabies can be quite easily spotted by flying one of these thermal drones at night, and you can easily pick them up, as you can see here, and then count them and then collect the ecological information that you need. Now Australia has a few other wildlife that we have also surveyed at night. Can anyone guess what animal this is? No? Chris?
Wallaby?
Yeah, good.
Really?
Yeah. so I'll zoom in a bit, and yeah, it is the koala. Very, very good. So it's an interesting story, actually. Koalas are, as we know, threatened in most parts of Australia, but in South Australia and on Kangaroo Island in South Australia, they actually have the opposite problem. There are too many of them on this island. In fact, koalas are not even native to Kangaroo Island. They were introduced there, I think in the 1920s or so, because they were overhunted or they're being hunted in the mainland. So they were brought to Kangaroo Island as a refuge to protect them. But then they became so successful that now there are, I think, over 50,000 individuals on that Kangaroo Island. And so here we were working with the Department of Environment in South Australia to use drones to survey and monitor their population. And this was one of the drone flights over a blue gum plantation, a eucalyptus tree plantation, because the plantation was just full of these koalas, and they were just chewing up the trees, which is not so good for the business of the plantation. So they wanted to find an efficient way of monitoring their population. And as you can see, when we flew the drones at night, the koalas are like light bulbs on a Christmas tree. Right? So very easy to spot at night using this approach. Now here's another interesting one. Anyone want to guess what these gray blobs are? Not quite. They are actually animals.
Sorry?
They are animals.
Animals?
Yeah. I'll give you a clue. This mountain is on an island called Macquarie Island, which is between Australia and the Antarctic. Okay, so these gray blobs are actually huge colonies of royal penguins. And these penguins are endemic to this island, Macquarie Island, and two other smaller islands nearby. The largest colony, I think, was estimated to be about 500,000 breeding pairs, which means at least 1 million individuals. But the truth is, ecologists don't really know how big they are, because how are you going to count such a big colony, right? The traditional way of doing that is for the ecologists to hire a helicopter, go up in the air, use a pair of binoculars, and then just roughly estimate 500,000 pairs. So that's super inaccurate, as you can imagine. So a few years ago, one of my other former students, Jared Hodgson, brought a drone with him to Macquarie Island to take images of these colonies, like what you see here. So this is one of his images. So again, these images are a permanent record of the colony. So by constantly doing this, by regularly doing this, we can keep track of how the colonies change over time. And of course, we can also count the number of birds. And he also developed machine learning algorithms to help him do the counting. So again, it's a fantastic use case for drones. Now, in addition to monitoring how populations of individuals change over time, we also need to sometimes understand the health or the condition of the individual animal itself. Right? We want to measure the health or keep track of the health of these animals. So the same student, Jared, used drones to monitor the body condition of some marine mammals, such as this Australian sea lion. So this is an image of a sea lion, a male sea lion, during the earlier part of the breeding cycle, when it was still quite round and fat, as you can see. And this was another male during the later part of the breeding season, when it has already lost a lot of weight. So it's kind of like those diet plans, and this is the before and after photos of the diet program. But these are also 3D models, exactly the same kind of 3D models like the forests and landscapes that I showed you earlier, which means they are geometrically accurate. You can measure their length, their width, even their volume back in the lab. So it's a very, very convenient way of monitoring the health and condition of these animals using drones. Okay, so sometimes we use drones for both wildlife surveys and the mapping of their habitats at the same time. Now, as many of you know, the snow leopard is one of the most elusive cat species in the world. Last year, my student Akash and I were invited by the Snow Leopard Trust to go to Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan to help them see how drones could be used for monitoring snow leopards in these mountains. It was an amazingly beautiful country and landscape, and you should try to get there if you haven't been there before. Because it was our first recce trip, we only ran some trial missions to map the habitat, and this is another example of a 3D model that we created just by flying drones over the valley. We also used a thermal camera, the other video on the right, to scan the slopes of the mountain for the cats, for the snow leopard. So it's just another demonstration of how drones could be useful for conservation. And we hope to be back soon after this whole COVID situation. Okay, so far I've been talking about some of the most promising applications of drone technology. Right? In fact, in the next few slides, I will talk about some of the pitfalls and the challenges. And these are also as exciting, if not even more exciting than the applications themselves, because it's through the challenges that we know how to improve the way we use this technology. So the first is about fit for purpose. Nowadays, when people come to me to ask me questions or advice on using drones, I usually first ask them what the scale of their problem is. Are you mapping a forest that is maybe a few thousand hectares in size? So that is about the size of the Bukit Timah or the Central Catchment or Pulau Ubin. So do you just want to map that size, the type of islands or landscape? Or are you wanting to map something that is much larger than that, maybe several tens of thousands of hectares, which is more like the size of Singapore? Or perhaps you want to map something even larger, up to a few hundreds of thousands of hectares, perhaps because there are different forests and different national parks in that landscape. So several hundred thousands means it's about the size of maybe the state of Johor, or one of the Malaysian states. So in terms of mapping as an application, drones are most cost-effective below a few thousand hectares. So the sweet spot is actually 10 to 100 or at most a few thousand hectares. For anything larger, it would actually be more cost-effective to use a helicopter, a manned aircraft, or even satellites to do that by capturing satellite images. This is probably the largest landscape we have mapped using a drone. It's a 15,000 hectare oil palm landscape in Borneo. And this product took the team several weeks with a lot of help from staff of the plantation to complete this mapping exercise. And at the end of it, we were saying that it might have been more cost effective, definitely quicker, to just do this using a small aircraft. And it's an example of what perhaps not to use a drone for. And of course, there are many other considerations that would determine whether a drone is useful and whether it's fit for purpose. So it really depends on the context of the problem. So the second consideration is the environment. Yeah. Thanks, Prof. Tan, for being here. Okay, so moving on to the second pitfall or challenge. Now, for many ecologists like myself, the reason why we want to use drones is because we work in very challenging environments. And sometimes it's difficult to even get to our field sites. And this is an example. This is when we were invited by the Nepalese government to go to Chitwan National Park and Badia National Park in Nepal to see how drones could be used to patrol their park boundaries. And to get to some of these sites, we had to traverse long distances over rugged terrain and cross rivers on these small boats. So it's quite challenging. And this other picture was taken by another one of my former students, Susanna, who brought a drone with her to Madagascar. And for her, it was even more perilous. Her truck had to sit on a makeshift floating platform to cross this river, and then her drone was somewhere hidden amongst the rest of her barang equipment on top of this truck. So very challenging situations just to get to the field site. And sometimes when we get to the field site, there are even more challenges. This is another drone that I built for a collaborator who brought it to Greenland for his PhD research on the caribou. And so as you can see, it's, again, different type of challenge. It's freezing conditions that he had to operate in. And this is Susanna again with her drone, launching the drone in Madagascar. Again, you can see that it's a very hilly terrain. So at the end of the trip, the drone was completely destroyed. You can even already see a lot of the duct tapes on the drone just to patch things up. And at the end of the trip, she actually didn't bring the drone back to me because it was just useless. And so she left it to the local village, and I think some of the local kids were very happy. They have this toy to play with.
The years of this is all 2012 and
yeah, about 2012 onwards, yeah. So the next issue is about the delivery of the technology, and more specifically, the last mile delivery of the technology. Now, for many of us, ultimately, what we hope to do is to be able to transfer the technology to the local end users, right? For them to own the technology and to use it effectively. And this picture shows me running one of our training workshops in Nepal to a battalion of soldiers. So in Nepal, the soldiers are the ones protecting the national parks. Previously, they have been using, they use very rudimentary ways of doing that on elephant backs and walking the forest and so on. So the Nepali government really wanted to see how drones might help them. So in some cases, we find that it's really challenging for these local communities to take up this technology for a variety of reasons. For example, language is usually, or can be a problem, a language barrier, and so we had to use a translator. But a translator is not an ideal way to teach, right? Because it's also another barrier. And then in many rural areas, internet access is very slow or even non-existent. And then some of these local community or rangers may not be that comfortable with technology. And many of them don't have the opportunity to use laptops, for example, or to use laptops as comfortably as we do. But there are some good ways around these challenges. For example, training the trainers is usually a good approach. Simplifying the technology as much as possible is another one. Just have one button to press to launch it. So there's nothing that they can do wrong. And also in general, as the technology becomes more mainstream and more user-friendly, many of these barriers will disappear, and the entry bar for the technology will also be reduced. Now, the fourth concern is about animal welfare and ethics, and this is something that's very close to us, to our heart. Nowadays, it's very common to see pretty pictures and nice videos of wildlife taken using drones. And I think it's generally a good thing because this technology is bringing us closer to nature and to wildlife, quite literally sometimes. But some of us have become quite concerned, how this technology is affecting the animals. Because even if the drones are not in direct physical contact with the animals,
behavior, right?
Yeah, it's behavior and also the stress level. We don't know how the animals are actually being affected, whether their stress hormones might be shooting up, elevated. More importantly, for animals that are breeding, we don't know how flying so close to them might affect their pregnancies or their eggs or their young, survivability of their young. So the scientific community doesn't really know. A few years ago, Jared, again, my former student, decided to design an experiment to try and find out how wildlife may be affected by drones. This is a fairy penguin in South Australia. It's a very tiny, cute penguin incubating her 2 eggs. Now, if you look carefully, you may notice something odd about the eggs. Anyone want to guess what's wrong with the eggs? No? Okay.
The shell or?
Yeah, something wrong with the shell. one of them. So the one at the bottom is actually a 3D printed plastic egg. It's not a real egg at all. And there's a wire connected to the egg running out of the egg. So the reason why there's a wire connected to the egg is because there is a lapel microphone embedded in this plastic egg. And the reason we did that was to be able to measure the heart rate of the penguin. So it's just a clever way that Jared, my student, thought of to measure the heart rate and in turn measure the stress level of the penguin. So with this setup, this experimental setup, my student could then fly drones at different heights, different sizes of drones, different flight paths and so on, and then get a sense of how the penguin is reacting to them, how the stress might be elevated and so on. And then the purple graph you see at the bottom is a visualization of the sound, the audio recording. I don't know if you can hear it. Maybe a little bit, but you can actually hear the heart rate, pump, 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 if you listen to it carefully. So it's still an ongoing research that we are interested in. And of course, we need to repeat this type of work for different animals to know how different animals are affected by this technology. We are discussing with the Singapore Zoo and the Singapore Bird Park to trial some of this work. Now the last challenge is about the quality of data collected using a drone. Now remember the royal penguins I showed you and I talked about earlier. So this is my student, my former student, Jared, with his drone on Macquarie Island. So the question is, can we really trust Jared's estimates of the colony size? No. How do we know that he hasn't missed out one individual over there, or maybe double counted another individual at another part of the colony? How repeatable and reproducible are these estimates? And just in general, how reliable is this new way of counting birds? We don't know. And the fact is nobody knew, because this is such a new technology and a new way of using this technology. But those are very important questions. If we are going to be using this technology to collect the data, then the data and the information is going to inform policy and decisions on land management and land use and so on. So we need to be sure that the data and the science is robust. So another major component of Jared's PhD research was to assess the accuracy and the precision of data collected using drones. Now, the first thing that Jared did was to design a bird counting experiment or competition between experienced human bird watchers, birders, and our drones. And I knew something was up when Jared came into my office one day asking me to sign off on buying 2,000 plastic ducks from China and to import them to Australia some more. So very strange request, but it was actually a very interesting and very clever experiment that Jared designed. So what he did was he created multiple fake colonies, artificial colonies of these plastic ducks on the beach in South Australia. So only he knows the number of, actually he himself doesn't know the number of birds in these colonies. So, and then in the one corner, we had these human bird watchers counting the bird colonies with their binos and scopes. And in the other corner, we had our drone pilots fly the drone, take images, process them using machine learning algorithms. And so it became a competition between humans and technology. And at the end of the study, Jared was able to show conclusively, and in a published journal, that drones did a much better job of producing higher quality data with greater precision and accuracy than these human bird watchers. So it was a validation of the method. Very important first step. But that research, that competition experiment, uncovered another interesting problem for us. Because as we know, in nature, most animals are not made of plastic, and they tend to be alive. And since they are alive, they tend to move around. So when Jared used his drones to count the colony of real birds, of fake birds, he can be sure that he has the right number of birds. But if he does the same over a population or a colony of real birds that are moving around, how can he be sure that he's not double counting? Because the birds are flying all over the place. So in other words, we need to understand how animal movement affects the quality of the data collected using drones. Now, first, we went back to our plastic ducks and tried to figure out how we can make them move around as we take the pictures with our drones. Perhaps having them sit on remote control cars and on the sand, and then somebody will be driving them and then simulating movement. But that became too technically challenging, and so we gave up on that idea. Then Jared and Akash, another student of mine, which I mentioned earlier, the snow leopard student, came up with another creative solution using game engines. Right. A game engine is a software package, I think most of us know, that the computer game designers use to create a virtual world, the virtual world of the computer game. Right? So it's a little bit like the movie The Matrix, where we can code for whatever we want in this virtual world. So by using a game engine, my students could then create a virtual world. They could create a virtual landscape in this virtual world. And in the virtual landscape, they can create whatever virtual animals or populations of animals they want. You know, virtual birds, virtual elephants, or even virtual tigers. Right? But instead, they created virtual populations of zombie bunnies, just for fun, and also as a prototype to explore what we could do with this platform. So these bunnies, zombie bunnies, can be programmed to move around randomly, at different speeds and in different directions, or we can also simulate their behavior to mimic how real animals behave in the real world. And then most importantly, into this virtual world, they can also code for a virtual drone, like what you see here, running or flying a virtual drone mission that collects real data. You can still see the zombies moving on the grassland, and the drone is flying overhead doing its mission. So this, again, is another very useful, very clever experimental setup, because now we can have the zombies move around at different speeds and whatever we are interested in, capture the information, and then see how the movement of these animals affect the precision and data of the counts. And because we know how many zombies there are, we are the ones who coded for them, so we have the true number. And with some comparison, you can assess the quality of the data and of this approach. So very clever experiments that they came up with. To recap what we've learned today, drones can be a very useful technology for conservation research and applications, especially to help in the enforcement of protected areas, in the mapping and monitoring of habitats or landscapes, and also in the survey of wildlife populations. But we also need to ensure that the technology is used for the appropriate purpose, right? We need to sometimes understand and adapt to the environmental conditions where it would be used. If we want to transfer the technology to the local communities, we need to be aware of the potential barriers and find ways to overcome them. And if we are going to use our drones near animals or wildlife, we need to be aware of any disturbance or distress we might be causing to these animals. And then finally, as scientists, it's our job to maintain high standards in our quality of data. It's always good to remind ourselves that at the end of the day, the technology is just a means to an end. And the end goal has always been to produce the data and the science to inform policies and decisions. So the standards or the quality of data is most important. I also want to emphasize how important partnerships have been in helping us to achieve our goals, and to realize the potential of conservation drones and conservation technology in general. And our partners in this work have included scientists, fellow scientists, government agencies, the corporate sector, civil society, and of course, philanthropies as well. Now, in the early years, it was actually near impossible to fund our work on conservation drones through more traditional funding mechanisms because it was not regarded as proper research or traditional research or serious research. In fact, many people thought we were just wasting time playing with toy planes. But thankfully, the National Geographic Society and a few other foundations and societies stepped in and helped us with some seed funding. And that kickstarted the whole project and helped to realize our mission and our vision. So I think foundations and philanthropies are very critical in supporting unconventional ideas that may be slightly ahead of their times. And in fact, they are the catalysts for sparking and supporting these type of high risk, high reward, innovative, a little bit disruptive ideas and solutions. And we have been very grateful to them. Now, speaking of solutions, and just to change gear a bit, I want to talk about something slightly different, but still related. Now, some of you might know that I've only just returned to Singapore, in fact, only in April this year, to set up a new center for nature-based climate solutions here in NUS. I think everyone understands why the focus on climate solutions. It's the greatest challenge facing this generation. PM Lee even called it an existential threat, I think, last year. But you might ask why the focus on nature-based solutions, and what are nature-based solutions anyway? So let me explain. This is a chart from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. It shows us the predicted impacts of climate change on nature and on human society if we fail to stabilize global warming over the next few decades. As you can see, these impacts are quite serious, they're quite alarming. They include extreme weather events causing flooding, coastal flooding, river flooding, impacts on food security, heat waves and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. And to avoid those disastrous consequences, I think there are two things we urgently need to do. The first is to decarbonize. We need to, for sure, turn off the tap of carbon emissions. Just stop the leakage. The second is to remove. We also need to remove the carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere. Now, in terms of carbon removal, how do we do that? There are, of course, human-engineered solutions, carbon capture technology that are being piloted and deployed around the world. But in many cases, these are just pilot projects, and they are not viable, not commercially viable, and they're not yet deployable at scale. They may be in the future, maybe in many years or even decades, but at the moment they are not. So what can we do? But fortunately, through hundreds and millions of years of natural selection, nature had already done the R&D, had already done the proof of concept and even the implementation at scale for carbon and capture technology. We see it every day, the trees, our forests, our mangroves. And that's the technology of photosynthesis, right? So nature-based solutions are just ways of making sure that we protect the remaining ecosystems, natural ecosystems that we have, that we restore those that we have destroyed, so that our and future generations can continue to enjoy these services that nature is providing to us. Importantly, in addition to climate mitigation, these nature-based climate solutions also provide many other benefits, including improving our air and water quality by protecting our watershed, the forests around the watershed. We are ensuring that we have good quality drinking water. It safeguards our food security, and it also protects our biodiversity, of course. So there are many co-benefits in addition to climate mitigation. Now, in this new center, I am bringing together researchers from across multiple disciplines, across science, the arts and social sciences, Faculty of Law, School of Design and Environment, also from other universities, our collaborators, to pool our resources, to pool our expertise, to work towards this common vision and mission of developing innovative and yet practical nature-based solutions to address climate change. And the center has two key mandates. The first is to produce policy-relevant, evidence-based science to inform strategies and solutions, climate strategies and solutions in Singapore and also the region. The second, I think also as important or maybe even more important, is to empower current and future decision makers in Singapore and the region to take decisive and appropriate actions to address climate impacts. Now, to achieve these goals, of course, we would be investing heavily in cutting-edge research, the science. But we also want to go beyond that, beyond the traditional research activities, to also invest in programs and initiatives that will build capacity, encourage innovation, and also facilitate the exchange of ideas and solutions among our young, not just in Singapore, but also in the region and internationally. So if you're interested, I'd be keen to tell you more about this center and maybe explore opportunities that for you to be involved in our efforts to help achieve these, I think, very important and impactful outcomes together. And with that, I thank you for your time today and very happy to take questions and keep the discussion going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Koh, for a very insightful presentation. We have a short 5 to 10 minutes Q&A session now. I have a question here from Matthew. He says, what is the range of commercially available drones, and do you see bigger drones to go further or get better pictures?
Yeah, that's your question. Okay. It depends on the drone, of course. For the kind of low-cost drones that we're talking about, or I have been talking about, even in today's commercially available ones, the flight time is usually maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and with that kind of flight time, you can, and depending on how high you fly and so on, and the weather conditions, maybe you can map a few hectares to maybe a few low tens of hectares, maybe 10, 20 hectares. But this is the low-cost drones, and I'm focusing on them because these are the most accessible drones to the most number of people, right? And that's why I'm very interested in this type of drone. But of course, if you're interested in covering very large distances, you could use the military-grade drones. Those would need a real pilot, somewhere in a room somewhere, controlling it remotely. Those could cover, many kilometers, large distances. They can fly across countries, across waters, and so on. But in terms of conservation and research applications, I think either use this type of low-cost drones for tens of hectares or hundreds of hectares, and if you need to do something more than that, then it would be more cost-effective to just hire a manned aircraft or satellites, or use satellite images. Yeah.
Any other questions? Can you just check, for instance, do you use it to actually look into carbon accounting, and so like if you have land, with trees, sorts of trees and all that, have you actually tried using the drones to actually do carbon accounting, how much carbon there is embodied in the fields and all that?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. Before I left my former university in Australia, the group that I worked with, or I set up and carried on my work, have been trying to do that, or they're just beginning to do that. And I think many other groups around the world are also just beginning to try to do that. As I showed you earlier, it's quite straightforward to produce those three-dimensional models, which in many cases, allow us to get at the volume of the vegetation. especially if the type of vegetation is quite open, so it's not completely covered. So you can get the shape and the volume of the vegetation quite easily. But to go from volumetrics, or the volume of the vegetation, to the carbon of the landscape, you need to know the carbon density of the different species. And even within the same species, there will be some variation. So there's a lot of scope for research. There's something we are also going to be involved in here in NUS. I'm just getting all my permits ready to be able to operate drones in Singapore to address some of those questions. And in Singapore, I think we are most interested in understanding how we can map and monitor the carbon stocks in coastal ecosystems, because we're an island and we're surrounded by archipelagic islands. So we call that blue carbon. And so we are very interested in using drones to monitor the carbon stock in blue carbon ecosystems.
So the question of offset, whether you can use that to offset against carbon emissions.
Yeah.
So companies, we are tracking our own carbon emissions and all that. But we do a land bank where there is actually trees and, so the question is, how do you account them and see whether there's a possibility of offsetting against the emissions that you produce?
Sure. Yes, so carbon offsetting is a very important objective. I think most important, however, still is decarbonization. We still need to turn the tap off, and then of course we find other ways of offsetting what we have already released, or while we are slowly turning the tap off, we need to offset the emissions as well. And there are already many different standards and methodologies of monitoring carbon stocks, whether it's coastal ones or terrestrial forest carbon stocks. But the current interest in my group to try to use drones to do some of that type of monitoring work is because a lot of the conventional ways of doing that is still very time-consuming, very labor-intensive, and in some cases may not be very accurate as well. And because of the time needed to establish the stock of a forest, for example, that is one of the bottlenecks for the launching of many of these carbon finance projects or carbon offset projects. So what we hope to do with this technology is to try to shortcut the process so we can have a larger pool of carbon offsets that would be available for companies to invest in. Yeah.
The thing is, permission from the government, for instance, if you have land in Rio Bintan or in China, so in order to fly your drones and all that, do you actually need permission?
Yes.
The provincial government?
Yes, we do. So early days, in the 2010s and 11s, it was still the Wild West. Nobody understands the technology, so nobody was regulating it. But nowadays, there are very clear rules and regulations, especially in Singapore. But they are not overly stringent. I think they are very sensible rules, just to make sure that the operation is safe. There's deconflicting of airspace, so we're not going to the manned aircraft space and so on. But there are processes in place for us to apply to get the permission to operate these drones for those purposes.
The last question is, it very costly to do an exercise like that?
No.
You have a few hundred hectares, and you want to measure what kind of potential carbon there is.
Yeah.
And then that's measurement. Then second thing is validation. Is there a way of validating to say, oh, it's confirmed that there's that much carbon in your stock?
Yeah, so that's part of the work that I was describing earlier. So there's still a lot of research that needs to go into understanding how well this technology can help us assess the carbon stock, including the validation of the carbon stock. But to answer the first part of your question, if successful, it's a very cost-effective solution. Earlier I showed you that 1 hectare habitat, and that took just 10-15 minutes to map. So for several tens of hectares or even hundreds of hectares, it could be half a day's work or at most a day's work. And you compare that to to the traditional way of doing it, where you have to send people on the ground to cover the same area. And that could be several days of work and many more headcounts to do that. So there's a lot of potential cost savings to be had. But we still need to figure out and be sure that the data we collect using this technology is robust enough, at least as good as the traditional way of doing it, if not better.
What's the traditional way? Actually go and count
Yeah.
the trees and
So usually what happens is if you have a forest, first we just divide the forest into some obvious sections. Like this section may be a younger forest, that section may be an older forest, so we divide them. And then we send people into the different sections and take samples, so measurements. So we measure the diameter of the tree, and then we may take some cores to get a sense of the carbon density, or the carbon density of the wood or the trunk of the tree. And then we basically extrapolate to the entire forest what the carbon stock is. So it's the best method at the moment, best available method at the moment, but it's very time consuming, like I said. Yeah. The question, Chris?
Using these drones, there was a lot of examples that were what I would call green surfaces, very few were blue surfaces. So is it much more difficult to, and so what's the difference of the use and the quality of the data within green and blue?
Right. Yeah, right. So it's very challenging to be able to take images of anything that's underwater. For example, seagrasses or corals, and it's an even newer research problem for many groups around the world, and we are also trying to tackle that. At the moment, the easiest way to map seagrass habitats, for example, is to just wait for the tide to go down. And then they are exposed, and then you can fly these drones with different types of sensors that can differentiate the green parts, because the seagrass is still green after all, right, with the sandy areas and other substrates. So that's the most straightforward way to do it. But we're also hoping to use different kinds of sensors, LiDAR or whatever, even including spaceborne LiDAR, to try to be able to perhaps detect and map these underwater or these blue carbon ecosystems when the tide is high, because that would make it more scalable even, right? You don't have to wait for the tide, you can just map.
And can you have, like you mentioned LiDAR, can you have LiDAR on a drone?
Yes, you can. But of course the resolution is not, the quality of the data will not be as good as the ground-based LiDAR, just because there's a limit to how heavy, to the payload of the drone. It cannot carry very heavy equipment. So everything has to be miniaturized. So there's, the LiDAR, the drone carried LiDAR sensors are getting better, but I think they still need to be improved before they can be really useful for the kind of mapping application.
And for mangrove,
mangrove is easier. Yeah, but even then, mangrove has another problem because, as you know, the roots are all over the place, right? And they're exposed, and then so it's a very, very complex structure. We're still trying. Different groups are still trying, but I think it's probably the most feasible blue carbon ecosystem to be mapped using a drone. Yeah.
I've got 3 questions. I ask all at once and then.
Okay. Remember, I might have to ask you if I forget.
What is the field project right now in Singapore that you want to get the permission for the drone? What is the field project?
The field project is to map blue carbon systems, mangroves and seagrasses, in the coastal areas.
Okay. You see, I think Singapore right now I don't know whether it's some of the conservation group, because Singapore is an island, right? They're much more interested in coral reefs conservation. Yeah, you grow the new corals. Okay? So how do you use it to do the underwater thing?
So it's related to Chris's question. It's not easy. For corals, I think it will be probably the hardest of the blue carbon ecosystem or the coastal ecosystems. So we will start with mangroves. They are exposed most of the time. Seagrass is also possible. Just wait for the tide to recede. Corals, we have to do more research on that. We're not confident that we can map corals at the moment.
That one actually you have to use manual people that go underwater.
Yeah. Usually that's what happens. Yeah, and also interestingly, coral may not be a very good climate solution, because they might be sinks, they might be carbon sources rather than sinks. So they might be actually releasing carbon rather than absorbing carbon when you do the carbon accounting. So mangroves and seagrasses are much more feasible climate solutions.
Yeah. And you were talking about using helicopters, right? What about in Singapore and overseas, right? Have you used because you see there are a number of private pilots, they own private pilot license and they have planes, their own planes, okay? But if they hold commercial pilot license, they actually, it's just like those, the medical aviation fellowship, the pilots are volunteer, they fly those medical supplies to region. So do you tap I don't know what is your philanthropist. I think the philanthropist is not just money. I think it's got volunteers. So do you tap all these pilot volunteers to do your thing? Because they got plane, they must meet the number of flying hours to qualify to do their pilot license.
Right.
So do you tap those resources because you go and get a helicopter, they got planes. So what's the difference between a helicopter and a plane?
Different users lah. Plane you can cover a much larger area in a shorter time. A helicopter you can hang around a smaller area for longer lah. If you need to hover in place, for example. Yeah.
So do you tap their resources?
No. So far the researchers that have been working on the orangutan problem, they hire commercial pilots, not the volunteers.
Oh, so you never actually write to them?
No.
Because I'm quite sure those private pilot, they don't know the project's going on, so they cannot volunteer, right? They really have to fly,
Yeah.
Singapore, we have a flying club here.
Yeah, I know.
Their own planes.
Yes.
They have the resources.
Yeah, in some countries there is also another problem in that you may not be able to perform some of these so-called commercial activities with a private pilot license. Again, the definition of what is a commercial activity varies from country to country. So in some cases, it may not be very easy to have a private pilot do some of this work if the government agencies consider this work to be for reward activity or commercial activity. Yeah.
But yours is not commercial activity.
Yeah. Well, in Singapore and in Australia, the civil aviation defines research as non-recreational. It's actually grouped together with the commercial activities. Yeah, I know that I'm a pilot as well. I'm a private pilot, and a drone pilot. So we've gone through some of these considerations before, and so it's not easy. Of course, it would be great to have those volunteer pilots, and they all need to have their recency, right? They need to maintain their flight hours and so on. So it's a win-win situation, but a lot of the regulations are potential barriers to making that happen. Yeah.
I'm afraid we have to wrap up. I think this is a very interesting topic, and do feel free to connect with Prof. Koh to continue discussion and to find out more about the new center. So we have come to the end of the session, and if feel free to have a cup of coffee or tea or hang out and continue chatting with Prof if you would like to. Just stay within the safety distances and we'll be fine. Okay, so have a good day. Thank you very much.